All right, Saagar, what's on your radar?
Well, on Saturday, when my neighborhood of upper-middle-class liberals broke out into simultaneous literal shrieks of joy, I found out the Associated Press and other news organizations officially called the election for Joe Biden. Of course, President Trump has not accepted that result, and he will challenge that in court as it is his right to do so. But from where I stand right now, there does not seem to be a viable path to victory for Trump in the courts, given that the margins and problems are concentrated across 4 different states. So over the weekend, I sat and I tried to take in as much of the results as I could in this specific context. Who is to blame for Donald Trump's likely loss in the 2020 presidential election? As I said here many times in the lead up to the election, understanding why you lost is the vital and most important question after a result, because it governs every decision that a party makes from that point forward. How they govern, how they work with the opposition, what constituencies that they choose to target, which policies to stand and fight on in the coming years. So here's my definitive list of the people responsible for this mess. Number 1 isn't hard to guess. At the end of the day, it was Trump's White House. It was his campaign. He hired many of the people I'm about to list. He could have fired them. He could have trusted his gut and tried to operationalize all of it into a coherent ideology and governing agenda. He didn't want to do that, so he bears the ultimate responsibility. But it's not all on him. He was the ultimate outsider. He never worked in government. He came from the outside, destroyed the Republican Party, needed help to enact his agenda. The Republican establishment could have cowed themselves. They could have recognized that this man, against all odds, won the primary and the presidency, largely on a message that directly repudiated them, and they could have adjusted accordingly to serve well the 65 million people who voted for Trump instead of repudiating them by outwardly trying to subvert his agenda. Which brings me to the rest of the list. Let's begin. This is going to be fun. Number 1 is Jared Kushner. Jared, more than any single other person, bears responsibility for Trump's likely loss. From the very beginning, he took over the transition team from Chris Christie. He filled it with a bunch of incompetent morons who don't know anything about government. He forgot to fill critical positions, and he allowed the idiocy vacuum to be filled by Reince Priebus and the rest of the RNC types who ran the administration for the next few years. He's the genius who told Trump to mitigate his best instincts on immigration. He's the person who pushed him to betray his base, pursue criminal justice reform when he had unified government. He tried the entire 4 years in office to woo the left and the business community to Trump's side. He pushed Trump to fire James Comey. He fought against his America First manufacturing plan in the middle of a pandemic, and he is the one who encouraged Trump not to take COVID as seriously in the later days of the pandemic. If there is a single individual other than Trump who is responsible for this likely loss, it is him. Next on the list, Paul Ryan. Paul Ryan never wanted Trump to be president, and instead of being humbled about how wrong he was the day after the election, he told Trump, "I've got you." He told him he would pass border wall funding in the first spending bill. Nope, that never happened. He said he would repeal and replace Obamacare. Nope. That failed miserably, and he's the one who convinced Trump to abandon infrastructure, immigration, and other legislative priorities, also he could pass his dream legislation of corporate tax cuts. And that is a friendly reminder in time to remind you that the passage of those tax cuts is the single most unpopular thing that Trump did as president, and his only legislative win with unified government other than criminal justice reform. Ryan probably always was going to play it that way. But he betrayed the millions who voted for Trump by actively subverting his promises to pursue infrastructure, to build a wall on the southern border, in favor of doling out money to rich people who he is now raising money for within a fake investment fund that he's working on right now. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention foreign policy. Remember, one of Trump's core appeals was extricating the U.S. from endless wars abroad. He largely failed on that count. Why? Because the people who worked for him worked their asses off to make sure it never happened. H.R. McMaster, his own national security advisor, browbeat Trump into increasing troop levels in Afghanistan. He manipulated the policy process and strategically leaked to the press. General Mattis is regarded as a saint domestically, but the sad truth is he's just as much of a traditional neocon as the rest of them. He tried to get Trump to keep troops in Afghanistan. He tried to get Trump to bow down before NATO. He constantly sang the tune of globalism in the White House. He, H.R. McMaster, John Bolton, and so many others worked for Trump, did their absolute damnedest to make sure an America First foreign policy never saw the light of day, and they did it against the will of the American people. Next is a group that I kind of lump all together. White House Chiefs of Staff Mick Mulvaney, Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, National Economic Council Director Larry Kudlow, and Outside Economic Advisor Steve Moore. Mulvaney and Meadows are both Tea Party Freedom Caucus veterans. Their only allegiance is to the false god of deficit hawkery. Beyond that, they don't believe very much. And when the stars aligned, they were in the White House to once again push against Trump's better angels of wanting to spend more money, wanting to strike deals with Democrats and more, by pushing him to govern more like Mitt Romney. Kudlow and Moore are the worst excesses of this ideology. I've regaled you over the months how these idiots convinced Trump not to spend more money in the middle of a pandemic, actively tried to get the Republican Party to turn against social distancing so that they could have an excuse not to spend more money. And they probably, more than any other individuals, are directly responsible for the single input that caused Trump's loss. I have no doubt in my mind that if he had pursued an aggressive and popular economic agenda since the coronavirus pandemic began, that Trump would have won in an absolute landslide. And finally, the list ends with its most generic inclusion: establishment figures who tried to change Trump when they should have been changed by him. Gary Cohn, Rob Porter, Steve Mnuchin, innumerable undersecretaries of state and treasury and more who acted like nothing changed in the election of 2016 and as if they were still working for George W. Bush. How else can you explain the number of people who worked for Trump himself who would immediately leave his administration and start bad-mouthing him and his administration? The best example of this is Miles Taylor, the dude who ended up being anonymous and who worked as chief of staff to Kirstjen Nielsen at Homeland Security. His objections with Trump were that he departed from deficit spending and he wanted to get out of Afghanistan. He summed it up neatly after the election, saying, quote, "Washington, D.C. is not broken. The American people are broken." Imagine that. That's the attitude he and hundreds of others who went to work for Trump had. That they knew better than the man who beat the odds and won the presidency by running explicitly against them. And here's the amazing part. Despite the fact that he listened to them, despite the fact that he did not fulfill his best promises of 2016, he still nearly won re-election with 71 million votes. The power of the Trumpian message is such that even when it is a mirage in reality, that it is a desired reality so desperately wanted by so many tens of millions. This is not about Hillary's emails and how much she is disliked. This is about the want and the need of millions to live their lives as they want without interference from cultural elites and to exact a toll and recognition of their dignity as Americans, that they built this country and they deserve compensation, that their way of life is not to be despised but to be reinforced, and that those at the very top have built their wealth by selling out those at the very bottom. That's not going away, as much as Joe Biden and many others may want and wish it to be so. It is here to stay. So you're going to hear a lot of postmortems over the next many months. And I hope that this is helpful. Trump's biggest problem isn't that he didn't listen to himself more. So when you hear the people who tanked his presidency try and say otherwise, remind them of their role and their complicity, and never, ever listen to them again. They know nothing. And that's my general list there, Crystal. Of course, I think Trump himself is single-handedly most responsible for all of this. He hired them. He didn't have to. He should have listened to himself. But I mean, H.R. McMaster, Mattis, Bolton, Steve Moore, Larry Kudlow, Gary Cohn, Rob Porter. I mean, I remember reading that Woodward book about how Rob Porter tried to take papers off the Resolute desk to stop Trump from withdrawing from different trade agreements. Who the hell elected you as president?
Yeah.
And this was all across the administration. Gary Cohn, he single-handedly delayed those China tariffs for a year. I mean, they should have gone in on day one. So many different people acted as if they were elected and not Trump.
Well, and Trump was so easy to play.
Of course he was.
Because all you had to do was flatter him, play
Yeah.
to his ego, and you get everything that you want out of him. I mean, that was the people who were most successful were the ones who were willing to, like, kiss his feet the
Yes,
most.
that's right.
And so that's the administration that he ended up with. You lay it out very clearly. It's really super simple. Corporate tax cuts, you're still in Afghanistan, and you messed up on COVID. That's it.
Yeah,
it's game
it's
over.
simple, right.
And you know what? It was all there for him.
No.
I mean, when he came into the presidency, I thought, wow, this could go a number of different ways. But if he starts with, let's say, a big infrastructure package, projects in every district in this country. Democrats will have to work with him on this. He had a path to having a 65-70% approval rating. And you're going to hear a lot of analysis after this election of like, oh, it's just that the American people are so polarized.
No.
They're just so divided. No, we know the truth here. We look at the fact that you've got, 70-80% of people wanted a giant stimulus.
Yes.
60% of people in the Fox News poll are like, we want government to do more. People want health care. They want jobs. They want wages. It's really not that freaking complicated. And because Trump was a Republican who stood for some of those things, he was in a unique position to work with Democrats and tell the Republican Party to piss off as often as he told the Democratic Party to piss off. And that was a big part of the original appeal, was like he was willing to trash Jeb Bush. He was willing to trash George W. Bush. He was willing to trash our involvement in the Iraq War. But once he got in there, he just became like a team Republican partisan cheerleader like all the rest of them, which ultimately wasn't special. And yet still, you're absolutely right. The fact that even with that damning set of facts, and even with the damning set of facts that we've all witnessed during the coronavirus, that he could come this close to winning again after 4 years of every mainstream media outlet spending every day, every story, all day long telling you if you vote for this person, there's something wrong with you. That says a lot. It says the hatred for elites in this country. Like, you don't have to do anything other than say, screw these people. And that is going to be enough for somewhere around 71 million Americans.
Yeah, and I love it. I mean, honestly, there's a lot more hatred than I even thought, which is great. And this is the thing, too, which is there are so many of those people who worked for Trump who actively tried to screw his agenda over. And I tried to lay it out at the most critical policy level, right? Jared Kushner for the entire administration or the executive branch. Paul Ryan destroying the legislative agenda. Mark Meadows, Steve Moore, and Larry Kudlow for destroying his last true crisis moment as president. And the foreign policy establishment in the Pentagon. And all of those people are going to be on TV trying to explain his loss away as Trump's fault and not their own. And I think they have way more responsibility for it than anybody else.
Unfortunately, they're in very commanding positions.
Yeah, but don't worry. They're all going to make a lot of money consulting and working on whatever the next GOP autopsy is. I'm looking forward to your Radar next, Crystal.